Soon after the great cities of the Indus had been abandoned, that is sometime around 1500 BCE, bands of Indo-European speaking migrants from the north began to filter into the Indus Valley and assimilate with local populations. These migrants are known to historians today as the Indo-Aryans. They spoke the Indo-European language of Sanskrit, and they identified themselves as Aryan or noble people, and thus different from and even superior to the indigenous peoples. Although they pursued pastoral nomadic lifeways and herded cattle, they were also highly militarized and skilled charioteers. Their ability to harness horses to wagons and chariots gave the Indo-Aryans a tremendous military advantage, particularly because they were using this sophisticated military technology against people with no experience of horsepower. This advantage meant that quite rapidly, the Indo-Aryans became the dominant elite across extensive northern regions of South Asia, although the newcomers also borrowed many ideas and technologies from the Indus civilization. During the half millennium between 1500 and 1000 BCE, the Aryans settled across the fertile plain of the Punjab, adopted many of the farming practices of the natives, and became the masters of modern Pakistan and northern India. They assimilated the indigenous peoples or drove them south across the Vindhya Mountains to join the darker-skinned Dravidians of the Deccan Plateau, helping to create the cultural and linguistic divide between northern and southern India that endures to this day. The Indo-Aryans brought with them new ideas about religion, notably the singing and chanting of hymns known as rik to accompany their sacrificial rituals. These hymns were created by an elite class of priests and seers called Brahmins, who claimed the ability to communicate directly with the gods. During this 500-year period between 1500 and 1000 BCE, the Brahmins composed more than 1,000 of these hymns and brought them together into the Rig Veda, a spiritual collection that is the oldest of the sacred books of what would become the Hindu religion. It has been used in worship in South Asia for more than 3,000 years. Veda is a Sanskrit word that means knowledge, so Rig Veda means the hymns of knowledge. This was knowledge possessed by the Brahmins to ensure the continued functioning of the world. As the Rik were chanted, sacrifices of animals and different farming produce were made to the gods in the hope of successful harvests, good health, long life, healthy children, and success in war. The Rig Vedas identified the most important Indo-Aryan gods, including the sky god Varuna, the storm god Indra, the fire god Agni, and the sun god Mitra, who would later be worshipped widely through Central and Western Eurasia as Mithra, popular with both the Persians and the Romans. As well as being a religious document, the Rig Veda has also proven invaluable to historians as a source of information about early Indo-Aryan culture. In terms of political organization, the hymns of the Rig Veda describe a multi-tribal structure in which each tribe was led by some sort of a warlord called a Raja. The word Raja is linguistically a close relation to the Latin word for king, Rex, reminding us again just how linguistically connected all of the Indo-European languages are. The Rig Vedas also show that the conflict between the Indo-Aryans and the Dravidians for control of the Indus Valley was ongoing between 1500 and 1000 BCE, leading to much destruction and devastation in towns and farmlands. As well as fighting local populations, the Indo-Aryan tribes also constantly fought among themselves, if the frequent descriptions of epic battles in the Rig Vedas are anything to go by. Gradually, the Indo-Aryans were able to take control of most of India, settling down to become farmers and transforming their original pastoral nomadic tribal structures into political institutions more suited to sedentism. Rather than constructing imperial states, however, the Indo-Aryans built smaller regional kingdoms that reflected the long history of competitive disunity between the original tribes. During the next phase of South Asian history, after 1000 BCE, the continuing influence of the Indus civilization contributed to the emergence of a new, more rigid social structure that explicitly divided the people into 4 distinct classes, or varnas as they are known in Sanskrit, from the Sanskrit word for colour. These classes were the Brahmins, the priestly class, the Kshatriyas, which was made up of the nobles and warriors, the Vaishyas, who were the common people such as artisans and merchants, and the Shudras, who were the equivalent of serfs in a feudal system. Sometime later, a 5th category of untouchables was added, so called because members of other castes would be defiled if they were touched by one. The untouchables performed the most menial and dirty work, including handling the flesh of dead animals through occupations such as tanners or butchers. When Portuguese merchants arrived in India in the 16th century, they quickly became aware of the rigid Indian Varna classes, and they called them castas. The English term for India's social system, the caste system, comes from the Portuguese. The caste or Varna system has deeply influenced the lives of Indians ever since it emerged. It became a caste member's duty to marry within the caste, for example, and care for one's fellow caste members. The caste system does have a certain amount of social flexibility built into it, allowing for members of the middle caste in particular to move up or down the social hierarchy. And the system also helped newcomers find a place within Indian society once they were accepted into a particular caste. The caste or Varna system also had powerful implications for religion. The important Hindu text, the Bhagavad Gita, which consists of a dialogue between the Kshatriya warrior Arjuna and the Hindu god Vishnu disguised as a charioteer, explicitly states that membership in each caste demands the carrying out of certain mandated duties, and that failure to do so will bring disgrace. As Vishnu tells Arjuna, "Think of your duty and do not waver. There is no greater good for a warrior than to fight in a righteous war. But to forego this fight for righteousness is to forego your duty, and honour is to fall into transgression." Despite the deeply entrenched and religiously sanctioned nature of the Varna system, it is hardly surprising that members of lower castes resented their inferior status. As Indian society became more urbanised during the first millennium BCE, merchants in particular began to reject their subordinate place in society. This contributed to changes in religion during the mid-first millennium BCE, changes that first began to appear amongst the Brahmins themselves. Around 600 BCE, a radical Brahmin sect emerged that openly embraced mysticism, spiritual discipline, and yogic meditation, and rejected the standard rituals of Vedic religion. These new approaches to traditional Vedic religion were written down in a collection called the Upanishads, which was soon recognized as the supreme realization of Vedic religion. These texts advanced the idea that consciousness within individuals comes from an eternal sacred energy at the heart of the universe, an energy or deity they called Brahman. The Upanishads also articulated the notion of the transmigration of the soul. The premise for this is that people's deeds in life stayed with them in the form of an unseen power called karma. After death, a person's karma might be insufficient to keep the soul in heaven, at which time the soul would descend to earth and be reincarnated in another body. Bad deeds, therefore bad karma, lead a soul to hell, and rebirth in subhuman form is a consequence of violating the basic doctrine of the religion. Needless to say, this rebirth of the soul in a new body was an endless and tedious process, and the only way to avoid this fate was to adopt the ascetic life of pure Dharma, or deep meditation. This led to the appearance of gurus who wandered the country as meditating ascetics, all of which had a powerful effect on society. Yet even this reformed version of the Vedic religion was still dependent upon ritual sacrifices offered by Brahmin priests who remained at the highest strata of society, were exempt from taxation, and received generous fees and gifts for their services. Resentment increased amongst the lower castes against Brahmin pretensions and superiority, leading to the emergence of new sects that openly attacked the Brahmins, claiming that they were charlatans who hoodwinked the people. But the most important development in this period of intense thinking about religion was the emergence of new ideologies, particularly Jainism, Buddhism, and later Hinduism, which incorporated many of the Vedic practices and works that we've already discussed, such as the Rig Veda and the Upanishads. These new religions became serious alternatives to the ritualized religion of the Brahmins and are further examples of the continuous quest by humans throughout the era of agrarian civilizations to discover meaning and purpose through religion and philosophy. Jainist ideas date to the 7th century BCE, but the ideology was fully developed in the late 6th century by semi-legendary teacher Vardhamana Mahavira, a member of the elite Kshatriya caste who left home aged 30 to seek salvation as a wandering ascetic. Eventually, he gained enlightenment and adopted the ascetic ideal of detachment and meditation, preaching this to a committed band of disciples who formed a monastic order to spread his message. To his disciples, Mahavira was Jina, the conqueror, and they referred to themselves as Jains. Jains believe that almost everything that exists in the universe has a soul, including humans, plants, animals, and insects. But trapped in their physical bodies, these souls are in a constant state of suffering that can only be eased through purification, which will release the souls from their prisons. Purification is obtainable through adopting the principle of ahimsa, which means practicing no violence towards any other living thing that possesses a soul. But the avoidance of causing harm to other souls is incredibly demanding. Jainist monks need to sweep the ground in front of them in case they inadvertently step on insects. They wear masks and also strain their drinking water in case they accidentally consume an organism and its soul. And they try not to fling their arms about so they won't damage any tiny souls in the air. Now, only devout monks were able to observe these behaviors closely, so Jainism has always been a minority faith. But the ideal of Jainism was incredibly attractive to members of the lower castes, because if all living things, and in particular all humans, regardless of caste, had souls, why should society draw sharp caste distinctions between different groups of humans? The Jains thus explicitly rejected social hierarchies based on castes, which meant that their religion was provided material support by various groups in society that were designated of lower status by the caste system, such as merchants, scholars, and even literary figures. This support ensured that the doctrine has remained influential over the past 2,500 years. A more accessible alternative to the classical Vedic religion came in the form of Buddhism, which shares some beliefs with Jainism. Both stress the humanity of their founder rather than his divinity. Both teach non-violence, and both developed monastic traditions of celibacy and asceticism. The term Buddha means someone who has awakened from sleep, and it was the Buddha's great awakening that resulted in his discovery of the eternal secret of the meaning of life. Like Mahavira, Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha, was a member of the elite Kshatriya caste, and he also gave up his privileged social position in a quest for personal enlightenment. Siddhartha was born sometime around 563 BCE in a small state in the foothills of the Himalayas, where his wealthy father kept him in a sheltered life of luxury, grooming the young man to succeed him as governor. But Siddhartha became dissatisfied with his comfortable life, and on journeys outside the palace, he became aware for the first time of the frailty and mortality of humans. He also learned of wandering ascetics who had withdrawn from the world to seek enlightenment and perfect their souls, and Siddhartha became determined to do the same thing. At the age of 20, Siddhartha left his luxurious home and became a holy man, wandering for many years throughout the Ganges Valley, seeking enlightenment about the apparent inevitability of suffering. He lived the life of an extreme ascetic, practicing virtual starvation and intense meditation, but none of these tactics gave him the answers he was seeking. Frustrated, he finally sat down under a huge banyan tree, essentially to find an answer to the problem of human suffering or starve himself to death. According to Buddhist law, for 49 days he meditated under the banyan tree, while demons sent various temptations in an attempt to sway him from his quest. Finally, just before dawn on the 50th day, he gained the insights he sought, attaining enlightenment. After announcing his new doctrine at the holy city of Benares on the Ganges, he quickly attracted disciples who organized themselves into a monastic order. The new order wore yellow robes and traveled the land preaching Buddhism and living off donations. Buddhism was not originally a religion. In fact, the Buddha claimed to be an agnostic with no knowledge of or belief in gods. But Buddha personally led his disciples for more than 40 years as they traveled and preached extensively all over northern India, until he died around the age of 80 and left his disciples with a final message about the ephemeral nature of life. Buddhism is called the middle way because it lies somewhere between normal human life and extreme asceticism and demands only a moderate form of renunciation. It is based on 4 noble truths. First, for many people, suffering dominates human experience. Second, the cause of all this suffering is desire or rampant ambition. The third noble truth is that suffering can be extinguished by extinguishing desire, thus allowing humans to attain the state of nirvana, or the going out of the fire of desire. And fourth, there is an 8-fold path that will help lead us out of suffering to nirvana. The 8-fold path calls for humans to pursue right views, right resolve, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. That is, to lead a life of moderation somewhere between the devotion to luxury found in so many human societies and the extreme asceticism of hermits and Jains. Like Jainism, Buddhism rejected the caste system and offered all humans an escape from the tedious cycle of reincarnation without the help of Brahmin priests, so it appealed strongly to the lower classes. And because Buddhism did not demand the extreme behaviors of the Jains, it became far more popular, particularly amongst merchants who increasingly used Buddhist monasteries as places to stay for the night when they were traveling. Language was another important reason for the appeal of Buddhism. The Buddha and his disciples avoided using Sanskrit, the formal language used by the Brahmins in their rituals, preferring local dialects to communicate more directly with their audiences. Over time, the Buddhists identified various holy sites associated with the Buddha during his lifetime, and pilgrims would flock to visit these places. The monks also constructed stupas, which were shrines with rounded dome roofs that housed relics of the Buddha and his earliest disciples. The well-organized Buddhist monastic communities received gifts and cash from pious lay supporters, which allowed the monasteries to acquire impressive resources and freed up the monks to spend most of their time preaching the ideology. These monastic organizations became highly efficient at spreading the Buddhist message and recruiting converts. And the monasteries also took to accepting gifts from wealthy benefactors in return for blessings for the attainment of nirvana. Buddhism also benefited immensely from the patronage of the powerful Mauryan dynasty, the first dynasty to unify much of South Asia into a single state. More about the Mauryans in a moment. Even after the collapse of the Mauryan Empire in the 2nd century BCE, ongoing developments in Buddhist theology opened new, less demanding avenues for salvation, leading to an explosion in popularity for the faith. The first of these developments was the deification of the Buddha himself. Although the Buddha did not consider himself a god, some of his later followers did, and this deification only helped increase the power of the Buddhist message amongst converts. A second important development was the appearance of bodhisattvas, Buddhists who are said to have attained spiritual perfection and could have entered the state of nirvana, but chose to delay their transformation in order to remain in the community as inspirational examples to others. Eventually, a new version of Buddhism emerged called Mahayana, which means the greater vehicle, so named because it has the capacity to allow more people to attain nirvana. Mahayana Buddhism spread rapidly throughout India and then along the Silk Roads into Central Asia, China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. However, practitioners of traditional Vedic religion did not take the rise in popularity of Buddhism lightly. Instead, they worked to reform the religion of the Brahmins and create a much more popular and accessible version of the religion. That version, which we'll consider further in the future, is known today as Hinduism. Okay, after this discussion of religious developments during the Vedic Age, let's return to political and social history in South Asia during the first millennium BCE, evidence for which comes from epic poems like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and also from the work of archaeologists. These sources inform us that the Indo-Aryans continued to slowly expand throughout the subcontinent, fighting many epic battles amongst themselves as they did so. The warriors were now armed with iron weapons, which made warfare increasingly bloody, but iron was also used to make tools that increased agricultural production. Eventually, all of the Ganges Basin was divided into a series of independent city-states, each with its own state army and a powerful king known as a Maharaja, or Great King. The Maharajas collected tribute from the farmers, artisans, and merchants of their states and used this to build palaces and other examples of monumental architecture in their cities and to maintain their courts and their armies. These developments had further political and social ramifications, leading to the entrenchment of three key pillars of Indian society which continue even today: the caste system, which we've already discussed, the semi-autonomous individual village, and the extended family. The autonomy of Indian villages and their governing structure of headmen and council of elders was critically important in maintaining cohesion within these kingdoms. Known as the Panchayat Raj system, these self-governing and often self-sufficient villages offered political stability across eons of Indian history, even as great empires rose and fell. This critical role for autonomous villages has persisted even into the political structures of modern India. In 1992, the Indian government formalised the Panchayat Raj system, which essentially means rule by village committees, as one of the three cornerstones of a three-tier system of elected local and district governance. The consolidation of the three-generation family also assumed tremendous significance in the first millennium BCE. Within the extended family, women were put into a position of subordination to men. This meant that when a young woman married, she automatically left her father's household and entered that of her new father-in-law, and also that the children in any marriage were considered by Indian law to be the exclusive property of the father, never the mother. Women were also expected to have a male protector at all times, be he her father, father-in-law, husband, brother, or even her son. And women were not able to inherit property and could not participate in Vedic religious rituals where their presence was thought to defile the process, although women were able to become nuns in the spiritual ideology of Buddhism. Most of our evidence for gender relations in India after 500 BCE comes from the laws of Manu, although, like the much earlier law code of the Babylonian Hammurabi, these laws can seem ambiguous. Some of the statutes are clearly and explicitly patriarchal, but others appear to offer women some measure of protection. The laws also discuss the extraordinary practice of suti, which dramatically illustrates the extraordinary lengths women were expected to go to in order to demonstrate their utter dependence on men. Suti demanded that widows go willingly to their deaths by voluntarily jumping on the funeral pyre of their dead husbands. Indian moralists recommended that widows of prominent men in particular should follow this practice in the hope that their example would reinforce patriarchy more widely. As Indian society took shape under the rule of the Maharajas, outside peoples began once again to play a role in South Asian affairs. Late in the 6th century BCE, the Persian king Darius expanded the Persian Empire into the Indus Valley. He faced little opposition because there was no internal unity among the competitive kingdoms of the region, and by 520 BCE, the Persians had incorporated much of modern Pakistan as a satrapy or province of Persia, a particularly wealthy satrapy that contributed enormous amounts of gold and other treasure to Persian coffers. This remained the political reality for the next 2 centuries until in the 330s, Alexander of Macedon destroyed the Persians at Gaugamela, crossing the Hindu Kush mountains and campaigning vigorously along the Indus Valley. He defeated a series of local Maharajas, including the most powerful, King Porus, and this created a power vacuum. After Alexander withdrew, an ambitious local prince known as Chandragupta Maurya used his small but well-trained army to conquer a series of regional states until much of northern India was under his control, thus uniting a significant part of South Asia into a single imperial state for the first time. Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador that had diplomatic relations with Chandragupta, wrote a detailed account of his rule, providing historians with invaluable information on Mauryan society and politics. Megasthenes tells us that Chandragupta established a splendid new capital at Pataliputra, the modern city of Patna. The capital was enormous, at 18 square miles in area, perhaps the largest city in the world at that time, and it was surrounded by massive defensive walls and a sort of moat that could be filled with sewage. The Mauryan professional army was similarly huge, as many as 700,000 soldiers, 10,000 chariots, and 9,000 elephants, and also an effective secret service. Chandragupta was fortunate to have the advice of a very able political advisor named Kautilya, who has also left us more invaluable evidence in a work entitled The Science of Material Gain. Like some South Asian Machiavelli, Kautilya was highly critical of anarchy and praised royal power as the source of stability. He approved of the use of force against weaker states, but also advised making treaties with states of equal power. As the Mauryan Empire expanded, effective administrative structures were put in place. The empire was divided into provinces, which were subdivided by districts, and of course by autonomous villages. An empire-wide legal code was also put in place, which was administered by a series of courts, although Chandragupta reserved the right for royal interference in proceedings and often heard cases while having his daily massage. The sophisticated Mauryan economy included a mining, manufacturing and road construction sector, a timber industry, extensive cattle breeding, and the promotion of interregional trade. But of course, like all great ancient civilizations, the core of the economy was successful irrigation agriculture and an effective crop rotation system. Chandragupta is an excellent example of how leaders were becoming more and more adept at the task of administering large agrarian civilizations, using a combination of standardized tribute collection, centralized bureaucracy, regional governors, spies, and powerful mobile armies to maintain order and power. This increasing adeptness at imperial administration, process that can be traced back to the methods of Sargon of Akkad in Mesopotamia 2,000 years earlier, facilitated the growth and expansion of larger and larger states over time. Chandragupta was succeeded briefly by his son and then by his grandson, Ashoka, who reigned from 268 to 232 BCE, one of the most successful and revered rulers in the history of India. The 3 lions he had carved on the top of a pillar that Ashoka had erected at the important Buddhist site of Sarnath in about 250 BCE remains the national symbol of India to this day. It was officially adopted on the 26th of January 1950, the day that India became a republic, representing the extraordinary historical depth of this modern nation. Ashoka's initial military focus was on bringing under control the one region of India that remained outside of the Mauryan Empire, and after a bloody war, the eastern state of Kalinga was finally subdued, but only after the loss of perhaps 100,000 lives. Apparently sickened by the conflict, Ashoka converted from the traditional Vedic religion to Buddhism, although scholars remain divided over whether this conversion was genuine or politically expedient. Ruling with the assistance of an efficient bureaucracy from Pataliputra, Ashoka communicated his policies and Buddhist beliefs in a series of edicts that were inscribed in stone and erected all over the Mauryan realm. They played a critical role in spreading the popularity of Buddhism. Ashoka also had an extensive road network constructed which encouraged trade within the empire and also with surrounding states like Bactria and Persia. As the adoption of his lion symbol demonstrates, modern Indians revere the legacy of Ashoka. But the empire constructed by his grandfather, Chandragupta, could not survive the death of his able and charismatic grandson for long, and the 150 or so years that followed witnessed a steady economic decline because the expense of administering this large South Asian empire just could not be met by revenues. By 185 BCE, the Mauryan Empire was no more, and India was fragmented once again. South Asia, the home of powerful Maharajas and emperors, of several of the world's most fascinating religions, and of a rich and complex society, was destined not to be reunited again for another 500 years.